I really thank Eric for a lot because I feel like he's somebody from whom I'm always learning and always provoked in the best possible way. And so I'm really pleased that he's going to be our last speaker for the day.
Thanks. All right, there's my slide, and here we are. So first I want to say, let's give a big round of applause to Scott and Wendy and Claire, the organizers of the Sandbox. And one of the most amazing things about this gathering is just that it's probably one of the most diverse groups of people that come together at some event like this. So I'm just curious to see, we haven't done the who's from so-and-so yet, have we? No, can we have the lights up just for a second? So who here is, would you say primarily, if we could have the house lights up, who among you would say is primarily, I think they heard me, thank you very much. Who here is primarily an educator? What you mostly do is teach, okay? How many people here are primarily designers, developers?
Are you the only teacher in the room?
Yeah, there were a few.
Raise your hand higher.
There were a few.
Designers, developers. How many of you are primarily on the publishing side? You're publishing commercial children's media. How many of you are researchers or scholars? Okay, interesting. Who I missed?
All of the above.
All of the above.
All of the above. I didn't say you only can vote once. It's an open system. All right. Well, I'm a designer, and so what I do is making things, and that's what I spend sort of my long hours doing, and that's what keeps me up at night thinking about, and the kind of ideas that I bang my head against, and what I explore over the years and the decades. So just to give you a quick sense of my background. This is the first slide. This is Fight 2000, a game I made in with Word.com about little girls on a playground. I ran a company called Game Lab for about 10 years, a studio that grew to about 30 people. Game Lab made a lot of games. We were mostly known for so-called casual games. Scott mentioned Diner Dash up in the corner. But we did a lot of educational work as well. We created GameStar Mechanic, which has since spun off as its own endeavor. We also spun off the Institute of Play, which is based in New York City, the nonprofit that I co-founded that's gone on to create the Quest to Learn schools, which you may have heard about. There's a new one in Chicago now, there's one in New York. They're public schools based on games and play as the model for learning. It's not just about playing games in the school, but the whole way the curriculum is structured. Since Game Lab closed a few years ago, I've been back to being a full-time game designer. This is a project I recently released for the Connect with Deepak Chopra, and it explores play as a form of meditation. Colleen had a slide of this. This is our experimental narrative based on Paris, May '68, the metagame, you've seen too much of already. I've also been working with Natalie Pozzi, who's an architect, on a series of games for museums and galleries. This is the first one we did, 16 tons, which involves moving those heavy sections of steel pipe and also using real money to bribe other people that you're playing with. This is our most recent project at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It's a game called Starry Heavens, and those balloons look small, but they're actually 6 to 20 foot diameter weather balloons. So it's just that they're very far away from those people, but they look like they're little balloons that they're holding up, and that grid of metal discs on the ground. I also do other kinds of weird experimental projects, games that you cut out of books. Rules of Play has been mentioned already, and that's my other book with Katie. And I'm a professor at the NYU Game Center as well. All right, well, here we are at the Sandbox Summit, and it is, I guess I was trying to think about, is what I'm going to talk about really that relevant? Very focused on games, and I realize that not everybody here is necessarily interested in games, but maybe my perspective on the things that I'm passionate about will something that everyone can relate to. So I do want to talk about a problem. Maybe it's because I'm a designer. I tend to think about things in terms of problems and potential solutions to them. And what I want to say is that I think there's a problem with games and learning, with a cluster of practices that are happening across design and research and scholarship and education. Now, the truth is that I hope I can speak for a lot of us, or most of us in the room, when I say that we love games. We're not just here at an event called like Sandbox Summit, as game researchers or educators, but we also love games. We play games, we grew up with games, or maybe we more recently fell in love with them. We see their importance in the world and in culture. We talk about them, we dream about them. We make games or game-like interactive experiences an integral part of how we earn our living and spend significant parts of every day. But I also want to say that I feel that if we really do love games, we're mistreating them. We're not doing justice to them. We're not treating them with respect. I want to convince you that there's a need for a cultural shift in how we think about games, not just in games and learning. And actually, a lot of what I'm saying is echoed in a lot of the other talks today. So I think that hopefully we'll find a lot of resonance. So one thing I want to do over the course of my talk is to offer some new ways of thinking about games. And to do this, I wanted to look at another vast cultural realm where people also do scholarship and theory and practice and education, a parallel field. And that field, in this case, was art. So looking for inspiration, I dusted off my copy of Art and Theory from my days of being an art student. And it's a massive book that's crammed with manifestos, essays, and interviews with artists and art critics and historians and scholars. And I thought I would, I thought I would need to do like very specific targeted research to find exactly the right quotes that would support me. And it was so daunting, I just kind of opened the book at random. And I found this kind of incredibly perfect quote the first time that I did it. And I did it a few more times, and you can see the bookmarks in the book. And I actually trimmed it down to just 3 in this talk. But every single time I looked for something, an interesting parallel between art and games, it worked incredibly well. So here's the first one of the 3 that I'm going to share with you. This is from an essay I randomly found by Corbusier, co-authored by Corbusier, the sort of icon of modernist architecture, early modernist architecture, and it's very interesting. He's really talking about a work of art is something that is kind of about manipulating the state of the spectator. He's talking about pleasure, which I actually think is something that we don't talk enough about in games and understanding games, especially from my point of view, from game design theory and practice. Now, the kind of trick that I want to do is if I highlight the words here, which have to do with art, work of art and spectator and art, and I replace them with game, then it allows us to kind of read this in a different way. For example, when he says this phrase that he uses, the state of mathematical lyricism, if we even think about what Heather just spoke about, I mean, this almost sounds like a term that was invented to describe the totally unique pleasures of interacting with the game. We're going to see a couple more of these too. Okay, so and that idea, like it just looking at games through a different kind of lens, so different than the kind of traditional ways that we look at games. And as a symptom of this problem that I want to talk about, here's a panel from about a year ago from the American Educational Researchers Association. So this is people studying games and learning. This was a very highlighted panel at this conference. So let me just highlight what this debate was in this plenary panel. The debate was whether computer games are a useful medium for student learning, or if we can kind of get that done more effectively and economically by other means. And I did not attend this conference, but I did talk to people that attended it, and I did read transcripts from the conference. And from what I read and what I heard about it, it was everything that you might imagine. That this debate really focused on games as carriers of information, about whether games can translate content, whether they're as efficient as other means of doing so. And so this is how top researchers in the field of games and learning are representing games and discussing games to each other, and also to the larger field of educational research. And I want to say that this is a problem. So as I said, we love games, but as game lovers, how do we treat the objects of our affection? If we think about how games and learning might relate to games more broadly. For example, if we were book lovers, and I think in this case many of us in the room are, myself included, but if we were really passionate about books and learning, dedicating our career to books, would we spend time trying to prove how great books are, or how educational books are as engaging as non-educational books, whatever that might mean? Would we advocate for book-based learning or better and more educational books? Would we spend our time trying to figure out the formula for the better and most effective book, or be actively trying to bookify the world? The whole idea of educational books to me feels just strange. I mean, there are some educational books, explicitly educational books and textbooks and reference books, but they're really just a sliver of how books can impact and direct and engage learning. So most of us studying books and learning, or books and education, would be less concerned about building the perfect book, and more concerned about how books can be part of a larger educational process. Now, I think this is especially interesting given that the talk about ebooks and interactive media, because when we think about the way that books work in schools, for example, I think that we should think about the way media works in schools. In other words, books are not vehicles for injecting content into a student. They're just part of learning. They're part of being an educated person, a literate person, a good person. They're something which exists and is deployed within these larger systems, social systems and institutional systems of schools and classrooms. We don't study exactly how you get information out of a book. Instead, we study and strategize how books are best deployed in a wide variety of educational contexts. To me, that's closer to asking more sophisticated questions about what education is. And just to put this another way, I think that we need to stop looking for the proof that games teach. And I want to say it just isn't there. That games can be part of good teaching like anything else, but there's been a tremendous amount of research focused on proving that this transfer question, that a game or a book or a film can get you the information that you need, that after you interact with it, you can answer questions, standardized questions, as Colleen said about it. And just proving that a game or a book or a film or what have you improves some narrow cognitive skill in a highly particular context doesn't really prove anything. To get to that proof, you have to narrow down the complex process of learning so that your model of a player or a game or of learning itself becomes some primitivized icon of actual human experience. So, Eric Klopper was in the audience and is giving a workshop later today. Spoke about this at GLS. It was a theme. There's a sort of a rising tide against this idea of questioning this. Questioning this notion of the fact that, did I hit a button on here? Is that what happened?
Yeah, we're getting you first aid right now.
Thank you. Then questioning this idea that I've been shut down. I've said too much. Questioning this idea that we should be looking for proof, or that it's so easy to kind of instrumentalize games that way. We are in danger of instrumentalizing games and turning something rich and complex and ineffable into a blunt tool for a narrow and utilitarian purpose. And I want to ask that we stop strip mining the games that we love in order to harness them for potentially dubious ends. Let me inject a case study here. This is a sort of a cautionary tale. Now, I was hired, and about a year ago, I was working for a building-sized game based on the U.S. Senate, actually for a library, the Edward Kennedy Memorial, that's also a Senate memorial, that's going to be next to the Kennedy Library, actually right here outside Boston. I was working with a couple of other designers, and we had made this game where players became senators in a particular historical period for an hour and voted on issues, trading influence. These are just images from the paper prototypes that we were using on these. It was designed for 100 players. I think we've gotten up to about 30 or 40 players in our playtests. You debated issues in a kind of a theater-style card game of point and counterpoint of these cards that you were collecting. And the experience emerged out of socializing and really belonging to committees and horse trading votes to try and get things accomplished that you wanted, some of which were your own personal goals and some of which were larger goals related to your party. But those things were often at odds with each other, which is exactly what the game was about. So we started with a game which was inspired by its subject matter and developed for a particular audience and context, which included a lot of technology. This whole building was going to be totally wired. We were looking into everybody having their own potential tablet device. So there was a lot of technology in the context. And it was an amazing situation, this game situation, to understand the process of the Senate. And as we made the game, we began to see how it could be educational, how it could be deployed with players. And it was a beautiful design, a really elegant design emerging out of this process. But after working on this project for more than a year, the project client changed hands. And looking at our new design, the new client, who was sort of taken over the game aspect of the project, didn't see all of the educational stuff in there that they were used to seeing. And their solution was actually to take the game, to take out the game, and they put into the visitor experience all this traditional educational stuff. They put in lectures and writing assignments. They actually had a focus on learning testable historical facts. And it got this what this served to do is got rid of all the stuff that made them nervous. Like the idea of players being competitive with each other made them nervous. That making the suggestion that the Senate might actually be about horse trading votes, which it really is. And we were actually basing those paper scorecards on actual cards that senators use to, in a very game-like way, keep track of how many votes are happening for a particular bill or a particular aspect of legislation. And they also were nervous about not knowing exactly what the experience of each student would be, that it wasn't going to be this controlled experience where they could really know exactly what each student would do. And they literally said to us, now that we have our educational components in place, and they put all this stuff in there, they made it more like a classroom experience, we just need to figure out, now we're ready, now we can figure out how to get the game stuff in there. Now you guys can figure out how to make it fun, right? And you know, it was one of those situations where I sort of reached for my revolver the one day I don't own a gun. So, you know, the thing is, what's wrong with that picture, that although the idea was to engage kids with the game as a centerpiece of this museum experience, there was no really, I would say, deep understanding of games, no trust of games from this new client. That gameplay at its best is messy and complex and improvisational and wonderful, and by editing that wildness out of the situation, by editing out that wildness of game, you kill the patient. Now, the actions of the new client on the Senate game, this case study, is a symptom of broader cultural movements in thinking about education. And so the good and bad about games and learning that I'm talking about is taking place in the context of a shift in public policy towards testing. Now, maybe this huge cruise ship is actually starting to turn, but people like Jim G have ranted for years and years. James Paul G, if you don't know one of the great scholars on games and learning, is that standardized testing and it's just dominance of education now is really dragging education back to the 19th century. And I think that the dangers, like games in a way, are sort of the cultural form of testing. I mean, any quiz is sort of already a game, right? It's already a sort of a contest with a quantifiable outcome. You get a score like when you play Pac-Man, when you take a quiz or take a test. So the ability for games to fulfill the quantification dreams of testers is dangerous, which brings us to gamification. And in this context that I'm talking about, of a shift towards testing, gamification, using the superficial aspects of games, like points and levels, in order to better engage and manipulate an audience, to me, it is disturbing and dangerous. It's essentially a marketing approach that instrumentalizes games. Now, I'm as someone who's worked in the commercial game industry, I'm not, I don't mean to tar marketing itself with this brush, and I think we've seen some amazing examples of incredibly, let's say, culturally smart approaches to marketing here at the Sandbox Summit. But what I hope we don't see is some kind of strange, unholy alliance between marketing and learning researchers and people interested in gamification. And the real danger is that the gamified model of what it means to be human is severely impoverished, right? Any cultural form implies, I think, or any approach to a cultural form implies a model of what it means to be human. And this kind of behaviorist model is really what gamification is about, especially when you've really worked in the belly of the beast, as I have for a while, working in so-called social games, games for Facebook and that kind of thing. And my question again is this really is this really what we want for games? Because whether we oppose or support gamification, the truth is that I believe games are going to happen. Games are going to be huge. They're going to be, in my opinion, the most important cultural form of the next 100 years, no matter what we do, no matter what the kind of enlightened, critical thinking people in this room do. So the danger in my mind is that we miss out, right? All of us, educators and researchers and commercial publishers, people that really care about games in a deep way, or care about children and learning and development in a deep way, are going to miss out, that we're going to follow, not lead, what happens with games. When in fact, the opportunity exists for the people in this room to create new paradigms for being educated, for being literate, for being cultured, or even thinking about Heather's talk, really for being human for the next 100 years. And I'm really not exaggerating. I hope to convince you of this. But first, our second break for art comes from Alfred Barr, who was the first, I believe, the first curator at the Museum of Modern Art. And so here he's really talking in this randomly found quote about how the art basically changed from its roots in the Renaissance up to the 20th century, when he talks about what happened to pictorial space, and that artists became less concerned with looking at the surface world, and more into looking at painting as a medium itself. Now, if you replace on the top game developers, just shifting the time scale a little bit. So game developers in the late 20th century versus game developers in the early 21st century, it's pretty amazing to think that, yeah, okay, in the late 20th century, we really had become obsessed with 3D graphics dominating games and driving the game industry, the meticulous observances of external detail, of sciences to look at perspective, foreshortening, anatomy, movement, and relief. Yeah, that's kind of where money was spent in the commercial game industry. But here in the 21st century, with the rise of experimental games and indie games, if you think about things like Jonathan Blow's Braid, or even more experimental kind of punk rock game designers like Cactus, that they're really going board with rendering facts, right? That these small indie experimental games are less concerned with that. So are we really, and again, what I want to ask is it's interesting for me to try and look at games through a different lens and say, are we really looking at games as systems of representation in this way? Or are we just kind of coasting along and not questioning what we're doing? So to appreciate what's at stake, I really want to appreciate the incredible relevance of games at the time that we're in. Now, many people have made this point today, and so I think I can not spend too much time on this, but what I call it the ludic century, right? This idea that the 21st century is going to be a century which is really focused on play and games as a dominant cultural form. That games are going to be the defining cultural form of the next 100 years. So what do I mean by that? Well, thinking in terms of big epics, if the 20th century saw the industrial age replaced by information revolution, I want to argue that the information revolution has been put at play, so to speak, the ludic being from the Latin word for play. The information age has been put at play. That in the 20th century was the age of information. The moving image was a kind of dominant paradigm for art, entertainment, and leisure, the carrier of cultural narratives from the news and history to storytelling and personal expression. But the 21st century is really going to have games at its center, or something like games, right? Things that are interactive, participatory, social, things where it's less about receiving information. And again, I don't mean to say that other cultural forms aren't important. I'm obviously making the worst kind of gross generalizations here. Music and theater and literature, all these other cultural forms are important and continue to be. But I'm making very large generalizations about what I feel were some sort of large cultural trends. This argument about the ludic century is really an argument about literacy. In other words, about the skills necessary to be successful in the coming century. Literacy is about making and understanding meaning, right? The fact that I can put in this case, type words into a computer and put them up on a screen. That process of me making meaning and you seeing it and understanding it, that's literacy in a traditional sense of literacy. About making and understanding meaning. Study of literacy has expanded from its classical roots in oral and written literacy to include technological literacy and visual literacy. My argument is that there's a new cluster of literacies that I want to call gaming literacy. Many of the speakers have touched on this about how things are changing, the kind of skills that people are acquiring. Or need to acquire in order to be successful and to be literate. So I feel like I'm sort of echoing some of that. There's three big components I want to talk about. One is systems. and Heather was asked about the kind of cause and effect of where systems come from. I think that, I think they're both cause and effect, but if you do want to look at a cause, I think that the rise of digital technologies, in a lot of ways, that's permeated so many aspects of our lives, from the way that we work and learn, the way that we socialize and romance and flirt online, the way that we conduct our finances, the way that we connect with our governments. So many aspects of our lives are deeply, deeply connected with networks of information, right? And so being literate, right, being able to make meaning and communicate and live our lives in industrialized countries really is deeply intertwined with systems. Now the thing about games is that games are the cultural form of systems. Now, every cultural form can be thought of as a system. A poem is a system, a building is a system, a piece of music is a system, but I would say that the games have a special relationship with systemicity. I think I just made up a word. To play a game is to tinker with the inputs and outputs of the system. As you play a game, it's SimCity, SimCity 2000, I believe. What happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? A game is like a miniature laboratory for learning about systems and how they work. Now, as Heather said very directly, this idea of ludic centuries is more than just being about systems. It's also about play. So you can't just explain a game through its rules, and you can't. Did I kick something out? Yes. All right. My time is up. I just plugged it back in, so maybe it'll reboot itself. Meanwhile, hold on.
Yay, it's back.
It's back. Oh, it is. I just need to pay attention. Pay no attention. I feel like I'm doing something naughty to the screen. All right. Keep them laughing and make them forget how messed up this talk is. All right, so we're talking about play.
Very nice.
Okay. Well, I don't know what I did to deserve applause here, but
You came back.
All right, I'm back. Yeah. So play is a human element of the system, right? As we decide to accept rules, which are these kind of, as Heather alluded to, these kind of more rational, scientific ways of understanding a game. But play is the human element of the system where we really. Oh, I've dropped my mic. I'm falling apart before your eyes. Sorry about that. Okay, maybe now you can hear me again. My voice is echoing my own head. Games really are the games really are the cultural form of play too, right? It's sort of easily said.
That's how I play Scrabble.
The many ways that and forms that play games is amazing. It's mind blowing, the diversity of ways that human beings can play with each other in the context of games or out of the context of games. And if you think about what do I mean by this sort of thing that that plays messy and improvisational, and the transition from the information age to the ludic century. Think about something like Wikipedia, right? In the 20th century, we had an idea of information that arose out of the rise of technologies that supported massive bureaucracies, right? That initially were non-digital, filing, new kinds of systems for filing, pneumatic tube networks in big European cities that eventually fell to digital technology sort of doing those jobs now. But information was still about accessing archives of data, right? There's been a gradual shift now. Wikipedia is now, for most people that are digitally connected, a main source of information and research for them. Now, Wikipedia is not about a set of experts that are creating information, right? Wikipedia is something totally different. It's a system where there's a very fuzzy line between the users of the system and the creators of the system. And actually, even the rules that guide the development of Wikipedia themselves evolve and change over time, right? It's a messy system, it's a human system where there are people policing other people and vigilantes and contestation of information as ideology and all other sorts of things are happening there. But that's play, right? That's the generative innovation and creativity that's associated with play. And the last of these three ludic century literacies or ways of thinking about these new literacies. There's plenty of other ways, and very related to the 21st century literacies that I think that the United Nations has put out and promoted. So there's a lot of parallels there as well. But this is my own game designer's frame on these literacies. Is designed, and really what Colleen was talking about this morning, that the idea of solving problems, seeing the world as constructible, as problems to be solved. It's not enough to understand systems analytically or to just be playful, but to understand that we have the power to change systems, think about problems and make them better. The kinds of dilemmas that face us in the 21st century, that again, that Heather talked about, environmental collapse and world poverty, pandemics, cultural change. These are systemic problems that really need to be understood as a complex set of interacting elements. And we need to think innovatively and playfully about them and see them as systems that we can change and redesign and make better. So these are the components of what I call gaming literacies. I'm not saying that in the future everything is going to be a game, or that even that games are a necessary part of these literacies, but I do think that this is one way of looking at this new cluster of literacies that people will need in order to be literate and successful in the future. And I think to my relief, a lot of them were the actual research. This is all just sort of my theorizing as a game designer, but I think a lot of the marketing-oriented talks very much tie into this in terms of the kinds of ways that people are interacting with each other with technology. And it's a relief to see that actual real research doesn't contradict my pure kind of oanistic suppositions. So the games are the cultural form, in my opinion, that best helps engender these literacies. That games really, in a lot of ways, are the cultural form of systems in play. And design, and the opportunity that we have to use games to help shape the future of education is profoundly important. So let's see, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit so that we have a little bit of time for Q&A. Games are just powerful context for learning. Any time the games are math and technology that pivots into psychology and emotion and storytelling and aesthetics, into interpersonal interaction and social dynamics, and they're these incredibly rich and dynamic and layered contexts. If you agree with this, the idea of instrumentalizing games as vehicles for injecting content again seems so misguided. That kind of thinking is just less and less relevant as our century moves forward. It's like teaching typesetting to graphic designers. The question is, what's needed? I think that we need broader rubrics for thinking about games. That we can't just reduce games to education, which I feel like is the failing of a lot of people looking at the intersection of games and research. It's like reducing cuisine to nutrition. So any chef would take offense at the idea that you can essentially reduce cuisine to nutrition. That the experience of cuisine is 1,000 things that have to do with everything from the kind of cultural references that can happen when you enter into a restaurant, to the aesthetic experience of the food, to the social experience of eating with other people, to all the things that surround it, the lighting and the decor, you can say, of course, that what educators and learning researchers do, that they have to restrict the domain of how they consider games. But if we think about food and cuisine and all the ways that dining and learning to cook and studying food and food cultures can be tied to learning, would we really want to say that food must be thought of only in a nutritive sense? And what I want to say is that if the problem is the reduction of games to information or to proof or to gamification, then the solution is the opposite. The solution is to expand our ideas of what games can be. And I think if we think deeply about games and how games can help us learn, we need to do the opposite of reduction. We need to see games in all their grandeur. We need big new ideas of thinking at and looking at games, big inclusive games, ideas for looking at games in broader terms. And I think the good news is that there's not just one correct big idea. There are many correct, exciting ways to look at games in new ways. And maybe I'm touching on a few of them here in my talk. Let me, by the way, do I have until 12:45 or until 1?
If we want to do Q&A, let's do 12:50.
12:50. Okay. So let me. I'll skip to this thing of design literalism. I think you guys get the idea. It's really just looking at some of the problems that we have with often when we look at educational games, they're incredibly literal, right? And my main point is that if you want to make a game that that, I was involved with the PBS funded project many years ago. So I'm sure that all the people that are in the room that are at PBS now probably didn't work there then. What ended up happening was it was about keeping at-risk kids in school. So a bunch of people got together and brainstormed, and the end result was a game that simulated a virtual high school where kids had to stay in that virtual high school and you were rewarded for staying in high school. And there's a strange literalism that we often have when we think about games and learning, that games can directly simulate their subject matter. Today I would say that what's the answer to the idea of a game that would keep kids in school? There already are games that keep kids in school. There are sports, right? Sports teams or chess club, that there are activities. Why not start a StarCraft league in your school, right? There are already competitive college level StarCraft leagues. So again, it's different ways of thinking about problems and trusting games more. The case study of the game that we did for the U.S. Senate building memorial is a good example of that. The metagame is a good example of an educational game that's not literalist, right? And that, there's no doubt that it's a game about learning and a game about literacy. And it's a game that that can teach literacy on many levels. Just knowing games, being able to make arguments about them, being able to understand the social context, so that as you're interacting with other people, you can know exactly what you want to say about them and how to persuade the judge the best about them. So let's take a look at our final example of games and art. This is actually from Barnett Newman, the painter. And I also thought what was interesting about this randomly found quote was that he really talks about, he's not really talking about, he's talking about his process, right? What it means to, in this case, to be a game designer. He says he never worked from sketches, never planned a painting, never thought out a painting. So I've never worked as a game designer from a design document, never planned a game, never thought out a game. I think, are we really thinking enough about games as a creative form? As something that people create, about the creative process of making games, as opposed to instrumentalizing them. The big way that I want to end with in talking about games in an expanded way and offering new ways of framing them is really thinking about games as an aesthetic object. Rather than thinking them as learning vehicles to transmit information, or even deeper cognitive skills or social learning, is thinking of them as cultural objects of works of beauty. Now, this doesn't mean I'm trying to lift games away from being context for learning. It's really just the opposite. I feel like I'm trying to rescue them. The metagame was inspired a lot by an idea of looking at and talking about art, which is an idea from education, art education, as a matter of fact. And it's actually an approach championed by my parents, who are retired professors of art education, Edith Zimmerman and Gilbert Clark. And I actually grew up in a house of art educators. So for me, thinking about games as aesthetic objects is actually deeply connected to thinking about games and learning. And again, I want to say this is a shift, right? Thinking about games as aesthetic objects is a shift. Art educators don't spend their time making art for learning, right? They don't focus on making more effective artworks. They're not concerned with educational art, even if there is such a thing, right? They might do rigorous research and even testing, but they don't try and measure the information that flows from an artwork into a person, right? Even saying that out loud just makes it sound incredibly bizarre. So what is it that art educators do? What does it mean to consider games as aesthetic objects? I want to give you a couple of examples that when I mentioned this, I was talking about this to my mother. She inundated me with suggestions and articles and books. Here's one of the art educators that she mentioned, Brent Wilson, who is a Penn State professor emeritus. And he looks at art education and visual culture and pop culture and children's development. He has this idea of living in a virtual world. Of visual culture. How do we live in these worlds? So that's an idea that's very, very much a game-like question. He's asking deep questions, a series of questions about how we live in these art worlds and these virtual worlds. Do we use them as ways to know our values, our futures, and ourselves? Do they enrich our lives through joy and pleasure? He talks about the fact that artworks always exist in larger contexts. And they really become ways to better know ourselves. He's asking really big questions. He acknowledges that art is artificial, that they're creating artificial worlds, but also they're in this world and of this world. And the goal of art education seems to be engendering critical and productive participation. So my question is really, what I've learned from art education is that it's potentially possible to deal with amazing visual media and cultural forms, but not instrumentalize them, to integrate them into an educational context without seeing them as transmitters of information, right? Not in our case, not as art educators, but game educators. Now these images are from the work of Edward Burnitzky, a photographer who's become known for his massive photographs of industrial landscapes. He has a wonderful documentary about his work, Manufactured Landscapes. This is a clean factory in China where they're manufacturing, I think, computer hardware. And this beautiful Red River, which is actually a river of industrial sludge. And these, by the way, these photographs are massive. They're monumental. I think they're something like 6 or 8 feet across. So when you view them in a museum, they really confront you very directly. Now, it's wonderful to see how Edward Burnitzky talks about his work. He sees it as a sort of a kind of a world, something he wants viewers to enter. And if you look at he sort of paints a path for you that that there's beautiful aspects and that they become scary, a forbidden pleasure, and that they tie into more larger cultural desires and wants. This is what I think is interesting is that it's not artwork with information to convey or a thesis to communicate. It utilizes ambiguity and contradiction in how it operates. And again, just to point out, this is one man's passionate and ongoing body of work. This is an investigation that's taken in decades, right? He's not a photographer who responded to a call for grants or from a client, who sort of handed a social issue or an educational topic and said, oh, I'll take some pictures for you about that, right? This is really an artist who has a kind of an ongoing investigation. This is my second example from the world of visual culture, of course. These are images from a manual used by protesters in Egypt during the Arab Spring a year ago. This is from Atlantic Magazine. They translated these images. So art education has expanded in recent decades to include visual culture. This is a map of how you get to and from demonstrations. So that this is a sort of a document from visual culture. And I just want to say, to me, this work is so beautiful in so many ways. It's clean and efficient design, as utility, as an artifact from a moment of time, an expression of a people's desire for social change. And it's also just beautiful visual objects. This is actually telling you that some of those materials you're supposed to get. So you're confronting police with spray paint cans, and also telling you to focus on the cameras and windshields of the trucks. This is about nonviolent protest in Egypt. The last example from our education is Graham Sullivan, someone who is at the Teachers College in Columbia, who researches cognitive practices of artists and critical approaches to studio-based inquiry. And he's asking very wonderful sort of holistic questions, right? About that he acknowledges that art can profoundly affect the ways that we see the world. He talks about art resulting from artists' encounters with the world. Again, if you think about the handbook, the Egyptian protest handbook, he's not putting art on a pedestal. He's acknowledging that art is an investigation, and he's not instrumentalizing art, right? And I also love it how he also includes the art educator in his formulation, so that the educator also plays a key role in this whole process. Now, art ed has its own rearguard battles that it's fighting in a context that I mentioned of kind of testing and policy needs. I mean, art education is the first thing to get left behind when standardized testing has taken over. And art education has its own narrow-minded ideas of what learning is, and I'm sure we could find many examples of instrumentalization of art in art education. And I know that the art education approaches that if you're from art ed, they're not rocket scientists, right? They're not rocket science, I should say. And they may be no great shakes to those of you who studied education. And in any case, art ed itself is kind of this old, musty discipline that doesn't even feel that contemporary, I think, to a lot of us here in technology. So if all of that is the case, why aren't we seeing these kind of more expansive ideas about what learning is, what education is in games and learning, right? Art ed really teaches me that we can do research on a cultural form and think about how it can teach how an aesthetic form can be an educational context, but without instrumentalizing it. This is a challenge really for all of us in the room, for researchers and scholars and designers, developers, publishers, and educators. Are we thinking about our work as profoundly as we could be? And what I want to point out is that we need to shift in how we think about games, from vehicles for learning to cultural aesthetic objects. Like I said, games to me are going to be the cultural form of our coming ludic century. They're going to forge ahead no matter what we do, and we can't miss the boat. Now, just to give you an example of missing the boat, Alan Kay, who is a hero of mine, a pioneering computer scientist who developed the graphic user interface and object-oriented programming. I'll probably hear at MIT if I critique Alan Kay, I'm going to be struck by lightning. But he really missed the boat. He was speaking at the Games for Change conference. He was talking about how games teach. And at the end of his talk, he mentioned Guitar Hero. He lamented sadly that game Guitar Hero is not about teaching music, but at least a few of the kids are getting interested in learning how to play rock and roll guitar as a result. And when I heard him say that, I said, wait, hold on a second. Teaching rock and roll guitar is good? We all assume that it's good? Only maybe 50 years ago, the idea of teaching rock and roll guitar was seen as downright satanic and responsible for the sort of sexual perversity and decline of civilization. But Alan Kay now today takes it for granted that playing music and studying music and making music is good. It's just part of being human. But playing a game, clearly a waste of time. Game designer Frank Lantz has commented that in 50 years, there's going to be some other cultural form that crazy kids are doing that will be seen as lamentable, a waste of time. And people will say, it's really a shame, but at least a few of them are getting interested in playing video games. Alan Kay never questions the idea that music is part of being human. Games are part of being human too, like telling stories or making images. Play is an essential part of who we are as humans. And that's my point. I want to break the cycle. Let's get out of this rut early. Let's not be the ones to instrumentalize games. So this may have been a rant, but it's really not a negative speech. It's meant to be a positive one. We have an opportunity here, an opportunity to define games and rethink what learning is in this century that we're in. It's not enough that we finally have government grants and recognition. We need to stop being so grateful to the people that are funding this. We need to stop dancing their dance of superficial proof and shallow thinking. We need to be smarter than them. We need to educate them. It's time for us to stop being cheerleaders and be critical and dissatisfied with our own work, with games, with each other. Loving books shouldn't make you a cheerleader for books. It should make you a snob. It should make you like books less. It should make you hate more books, right? More of the crap that's out there. We need to be game snobs, right, in our own field. But like the kids that we're making games for. They're incredible snobs about what is and isn't a good game. Why make games that no one is ever going to want to play? It's not enough that the White House funded games about obesity. We need to be honest and tell the White House that this kind of literal-minded throwback to obesity games is not a victory, right? It's sort of dragging us backwards. Educational games doesn't have to mean the textbooks and instructional videos of games. It can mean the critical paradigm for looking at games. That this way of understanding and understanding the relevance of this beautiful aesthetic form that we all love. So people working in games, not just learning in games, they're desperate for new paradigms. It's a recognized crisis in everything from game design and development to games journalism. People don't know how to write about games or think about games or understand what games are and what they can be. I feel that the people in this room that are looking at the intersection of learning and youth and technology and media, we can be the people in this room to help define and expand the cultural form of this next century. Just to finish up with some suggestions, we need to stop looking for the proof that games teach. Let's reject the instrumentalization of games, expand our concepts of learning, not reduce games to carriers of information. From designers or anyone else, let's be wary of design literalism. Let's appreciate what's at stake in the coming centuries. Think as big as we can. Think expansively, not reductively. Let's consider games as aesthetic objects, shoulder to shoulder with film and television, music and literature, and other things that help us be human. Let's embrace models that really challenge us to think in those ways, like art education. Let's not be complacent. Let's be a snob and celebrate our love for games that way. Challenge and educate each other and be playful. Finally, I just want to end with an anecdote. I recently met Andrew Hiskins, he's leading what he called the learning services at the State Library of Victoria in Australia. He's doing interesting, innovative work, and he told me that in one recent workshop, it was about how students could teach the teachers. He met with children, was trying to get them to help him understand how the students could better teach the teachers about technology, about games, about their lives and their needs. And at first the students really had trouble wrapping their heads around this usual inversion of what they were supposed to be doing. But eventually they started getting it, and then they took to it. They started overflowing with recommendations and strategies. And as Andrew put it, one of the students told him, okay, we understand you now. We think it could be possible to teach the teachers, but first, they really have to want to learn.
Questions here. So Chris first. All right.
So, stipulate that everybody knows in this room at least that games teach
Yes.
many things.
Yes. A lot of my talking is preaching to the choir.
But we want to build some systems or games that have a goal. That say, I like this, I think that this type of game could teach this thing. And without pulling out that test that says, okay, prove it. And that's where what kinds of constructs can you get out of that to say, okay, I made this for a purpose. How do I know that I'm getting the results of the purpose of this game without saying, one, where did Reggie find it all?
Right. I think you're getting it right to the heart of the question of assessment, right? How can we prove that games can teach? And I guess there's a couple answers to that. One way is that we need to totally rethink what assessment is, right? That our current models of assessment. Now, as Heather said, I don't know anything, so I'm speaking out of my depth. But from talking to my colleagues who study games and learning and assessment specifically, most assessment today is focused on very low-level thinking skills and higher-level things that have to do with creativity and innovation, and the kinds of ludic sensory literacies are much harder to test and assess. And Eric Klopfer, if you're in the room, maybe you can address that. But a lot of the traditional ideas about assessment are kind of being debunked. That it's about locating two variables within a sort of a field of infinite complexity, right? Of all the things that could affect them. So maybe the whole idea of the standardized testing and assessment being so prominent in learning needs to be diminished. Maybe there can be other paradigms that have to do with less quantitative and more qualitative assessment, or maybe, as Jim G says, it really has to do with the whole structure of education, the physical structures of schools, the institutional structures, the curricular structures, and we're really talking about a need for a more wholesale revolution of an education system. Now that doesn't help you as a developer or a publisher who's trying to figure out, how do I make a game that teaches this thing? Well, I would say one way to start is think about what games are good at. And as Colleen said this morning, I don't think games are necessarily good at imparting information. They're not best at that. I think there are other media that are actually quite good at that in context. What we were doing with the Senate game was not about having people learn historical facts. This happened on this date and this happened on that date. We were trying to get them to see how the Senate worked as a process. So part of it is saying, what is the systemic aspect or playful aspect of my subject matter, and how can I harness that and put that into a game? Where all the problems with games, that people play them differently, that they're competitive, that and unpredictable, but those become, as we say in software development, those become features instead of bugs. So I think part of it is also, that's the part about design literalism, right? That we don't have to think that we're simulating our subject matter, or that instead, what we had with the Senate game was a very abstract simulation. Actually every build was actually based on a historical moment, so it was in a historical context, but we were less concerned with that. We were more concerned with can we have kids really understand how government worked? A worm's eye view of the kind of the negotiation and game-like aspects of the Senate. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. So you can try and redefine assessment. You can work on it on a design level, and I also think it needs to be addressed on a policy level too.
I mean, it's also, I think, a well-designed game is its own assessment, right? Because in order to master the skills inherent in it, you can't succeed in the game, whatever that standard is, without getting to it. And I think also in the Senate game, however, an effect of that is it would learn historical facts in a context where they're useful, and it's much better than simply saying transmit this knowledge, is being able to use information rather than memorize it. And just a last quick thing, which is I think that as we look at the range of respecting games and what they're capable of, just as in art, I think it actually means opening up the entire spectrum. So, for instance, drawing can be used to show anatomy in a way that helps someone who's going to do surgery know what to cut and what to keep and etc. And it actually needs to transmit information. And that's actually a critical use of visualization. Visualization can communicate information very specifically in order to help us understand it more quickly and use it. And I think in the same way, games, we should look at the entire spectrum of what games are capable of. As a purely aesthetic, reflective experience, as something that teaches a more complex system, or perhaps something that when we need some information, there are ways that we can do it. And then I think if we look at that, it actually is that if they really are an art form, just like visual representation, they have this enormous spectrum of what they can do, and we should actually be respectful of that entire spectrum, but learn what's appropriate and what really works, and respect the game and the gamers in our design.
I think that's a great point. And in Carlos' workshop yesterday, there was an interesting discussion near the end about, well, you know, we talk about systems thinking and making learning pleasurable, but teachers do have factual information that they need. You can say, can games do that? Well, I'm suggesting a couple things. One is, maybe games aren't the best means for looking at that kind of information transmission aspects of education. But the other thing is, I think the other thing is maybe I'm doing a bit of an overcorrection and saying, you know, I don't want to too much devalue content-based learning or curricular content, right, and learning information. I understand that that's an important part of childhood learning and classroom learning and informal learning. But I do think that we're missing out, right? That maybe we do need to have a correction to rebalance things to look at the larger spectrum.
Hi, Eric. I first wanted to say thank you so much. I love everything that you had to say today, and
Next question.
This is a comment and question. I think for all of us who are constantly thinking about how do we leverage what we know as playful, entertaining gameplay in a way that's meaningful for kids, and having been a former teacher and now on the other side a producer of content and a media company who has to sell the content, I think the greatest challenge for a lot of folks here is how to course correct what are meaningful skills for kids. So a lot of the businesses here need to teach ABCs and 1, 2, 3s because standardized tests and teachers and parents have these expectations. But when I was a kid, when there was no technology, I was playing Mastermind and Stratego and Risk and all of these, and chess and checkers, all of these games that allowed me to develop my logic and my problem-solving skills and think innovatively about what strategy I was going to employ to finally beat my brother at the game. And those are the things that in this 21st century are the skills that are meaningful to business. And how do we effectively transform what is considered high-valued skills both in the classroom and in our home lives with parents and set expectations in the consumer world around those higher order thinking skills, because that is what I completely agree with you. We're trying to force fit something into gaming that may not just be inherent in the value of playing a game.
Right. I mean, it's a really complicated issue because there's so many aspects of the question. There's policy aspects of what happens in schools. There's parents' expectation issues about what they think a proper educational experience should be. But I do agree with you in terms of trying to fit, in terms of how games can engage with those higher level thinking skills. It's a fascinating time because I feel like in a lot of ways, I'm thinking about some of the presentations that happened here. There's multiple things that are going on. I do feel that education is not keeping up with what's needed just for job skills, right? I mean, the standardized testing regime. I've read studies that say that certain tests of quote-unquote creativity, Americans are getting less creative. That's always been Americans' advantage, right, in a global economy. And so the kinds of jobs that American kids are getting educated for. On the other hand, there's a weird explosion of creativity or interaction or agency relative to media, right? And so in a lot of ways, maybe some of those things are happening. I mean, if games really are these wonderful contexts for teaching higher level skills, mostly kids are not playing educational games. Mostly they are playing commercial games for entertainment, right? So maybe part of it is doing what people like Kurt Squire have done and say, well, can we harness the great aspects of, you said, chess and Risk and other commercial games for educational ends? You know, is it a matter of reframing that? I also think it's changing as parents more and more are gamers, right? There's no longer a weird cultural divide. That since if parents are gamers now, a lot of them, of course they say, of course I learned about problem solving from chess. You know, of course I learned about probability theory from playing Dungeons and Dragons. And so there's the cultural shifts are happening in a lot of directions. At the same time, the slide that I'm still chewing on was, I think, in the Nickelodeon, that great Nickelodeon presentation about Angry Birds, and many of the iOS games are the same for kids and adults, right? And there's also a weird dumbing down that's happened with certain genres of games on certain platforms, right? And I'm saying that that's the snob part of me speaking out. So that's all. Is that good that children and adults are playing the same games? Are children getting more sophisticated, or is it reaching some weird middle? It's hard, and I also think that not every game is great educationally, right? I don't want to paint this golden halo around every game. I think that I was just out with friends whose 7-year-old kid was playing Temple Run, and it's hard for me to. That's a game where it's really more about almost eye-hand coordination, reflex skill building. It seems limited in terms of the ceiling of the level of creativity, as opposed to something like SimCity or Little Big Planet that's come up a couple times via the metagame today. So it's a really complicated question. I think the best thing that we can do as designers and developers is just to be as smart and sophisticated as possible and try and educate everyone that we meet with, right? To really try and elevate the level of discourse and understanding, which is sort of what I'm trying to do here. I know I'm over time. It's time to eat lunch. Is that the last question?
That's the last
All right. Thank you very, very much.